So we're going to be moving on to our next speaker. So these next two actually talks are going to be from PhD students here at Utah State. And so our first student is Will Munger, who is a PhD student here in the Climate Adaptation Science program in the Department of Environment and Society. And his research uses transdisciplinary social-ecological approaches to support regenerative rangeland and watershed management. He's going to be talking to us about some of his work in Bolivia. Thanks, Will.
All right, so today is a day of contrast because we're going to be talking about something completely different than Ryan's talk, and in contrast to both Ryan and Chase, I'm coming from the beginning of a PhD process, and so they put the greenhorn in between the more experienced ones. So today we're going to be talking about Reciprocal Watershed Agreements, which is a program that is happening in the Rio Grande-Valles Cruzeños area of Bolivia. So not only are we I guess the connection here is that we're not only in the Western Hemisphere, but in particular we're talking about managing lands for managing water. But today we're going to be talking about it from a social science perspective. So I'm a very junior member of a larger team that includes geographers, agricultural economists, statisticians, and anthropologists. And what we're looking at is this particular idea of reciprocal watershed agreements and how it's playing out in this area in Bolivia. So reciprocal watershed agreements, or Acuerdos Recíprocos de Agua, or ARAs, as they're kind of referred to locally, manage water by managing land, particularly through incentivizing changes in agricultural land use, grazing, farming, and timber. And so our research area is here in kind of the central part of Bolivia. And so if you think this is the Andes right here, and then this is the Amazon basin down here, and then this is the Chaco, you're kind of in the intersection of all that. And the Rio Grande is starting on the eastern slope of the Andes, kind of by Sucre, that sort of area, and flowing east, going through the Valles Cruzeños area, which is kind of an arid upland sort of area, really steep valleys. And it's the major watershed for Santa Cruz. Now, Santa Cruz is a big city out on the lowlands in eastern Bolivia, but it's the fastest growing city in Latin America. It's the hub of a lot of big ag. It's the hub of a lot of oil and gas extraction that's happening in that area. And the Valles Cruzeños is its watershed catchment. So there's a lot of interest in long-term planning around watershed security. But unlike a lot of western watersheds out here, it's not that much public land. There is a big park area called Parque Nacional Amborro just above this study area. But the area that we're going to be talking about is mostly working lands. It's small farmers and ranchers. And so this Payment for Ecosystem Service project that's at the core of the ARA program is a little similar to the Santa Fe presentation that we heard earlier, but the difference is that this is a mosaic of private lands as opposed to public lands. So the question is, how do you coordinate all these small farmers and ranchers spread out over this large area? So the ARA program is a variant of Payment for Ecosystem Services. And the basic idea here is that something like hydrology that's moving through an area has value to people downstream, but it's not appropriately incentivized for people to adopt best conservation practices. So the idea is that you build an incentive structure that appropriately rewards those people for good management practices. And so this picture that you're seeing up here is the Rio Grande is down below in that valley. And this is what's called an atajado, which is basically a glorified cattle pond built with heavy equipment. And here you see the municipal agricultural technician showing the forestry engineer from our NGO partner, which is called Fundación Natura Bolivia, as well as the local alcalde or mayor and her staff, how they're building these big irrigation projects. So this is a coupling of a nonprofit who are running these ARA programs, putting out these contract incentives to farmers and ranchers, and they're then coupling their efforts with these municipalities to do these larger watershed sort of developments. And so the incentives that we're actually talking about are a couple different things. You get irrigation tubing, you can get pasture seeds and fencing, and you can get bee boxes and fruit tree starts. And in return for these materials, you commit to protecting a certain amount of land in hectares for about 3 years. And there's a couple different levels of contracts. One is that you're just leaving that area alone. Another, you're able to graze in that area, but keep a lot of the riparian vegetation. The priority for where these ARAs, or the ARAs, are being rolled out is mostly in water catchment areas, basically the riparian areas and forests around there. So the basic equation here is you're protecting forests to protect watersheds, to protect water for humans. And that's kind of the basic logic that is being talked about with the participants. However, PES programs have been associated with increases in social inequity. And this is something that's been documented around the world, both in Latin America, but in other study sites in Africa and Southeast Asia. And so what we want to think about is how do you co-produce both environmental and social equity outcomes in these programs? And are there aspects of the program design that can help us meet these two sort of goals? So at the core of the payment for ecosystem service model is the idea that contracts and these payments must be conditional. So this makes a lot of sense, right? If you're a farmer and you're saying, I'm going to protect this amount of land, me as the environmental NGO and municipality want to be able to go to you and say, prove it. Show us the amount of area that you're doing. And most of these programs have pretty extensive monitoring, both using remote sensing and on the ground to validate a lot of the conservation that is supposedly happening in there. But this idea of conditionality in other development schemes has kind of been questioned. So for example, unconditional cash transfer programs are a popular way of approaching anti-poverty sort of work. And so if, for example, you're a pregnant woman in this study site, you have access to healthcare no matter what. That is an unconditional service that's provided to you. But we want to think about, can conditionality be removed from this ARA model and still produce the same environmental and social outcomes? And there's a couple reasons why you would want to do that. If you're an environmental NGO, there's significant cost associated with monitoring. And so if you're able to show that unconditional contracts still produce the same environmental and social outcomes, your operating costs are less. So our partner, Fundación Natura Bolivia, is very interested in seeing, can we adjust this part of our ARA model and still have the same sort of outcomes? The other aspect is from the social equity perspective. So conditionality is sometimes a barrier to entry in these programs. And in other places, it's been shown that marginalized people are more likely to participate in programs when the barriers of conditionality are lower. In particular, poor people and women have higher participation rates in unconditional programs elsewhere. And we want to see, is that going to be the case in this study area? So our research question are, does and how does conditionality in these PES programs shape the human relations at an individual, household, and community scales? And most importantly, experimentally, to what extent can this conditionality be removed to produce greater social equity without sacrificing environmental outcomes? And these are all pictures from my fieldwork this past summer. This is kind of looking towards the Andes, and the Rio Grande is kind of coming out of here. And what you're seeing is these huge dust storms from deforestation that's happened that's kicking up all this dust, which is why you're getting that sort of dramatic sun effect happening in there. Another thing about equity that I want to talk about real quick, there's a long history here that's really important to understand. In the valley, literally right below this, was where Che Guevara was executed in the late 60s. And Bolivia is one of the poorest countries in South America. So when we're talking about social equity as part of environmental conservation, there's very real implications here, both for the farmers and ranchers who are participating and the larger municipal politics that allow this sort of conservation to go forward. So social equity isn't some nice feather that we put in our hat. It's a real prerequisite for these sort of programs to work. So we want to really show that that's actually the case. So the project objectives, when we break it down to our particular things that we want to do, are, can we remove conditionality from PES contracts and still have the same environmental conservation outcomes? And we're lucky to have a good partner in Fundación Natura Bolivia because they have extensive environmental land cover and hydrology data, and so we're able to engage that data, and our job is to build the social data to complement that. Additionally, we want to think, does conditionality being removed from PES have impacts on social equity outcomes. Are rich people becoming richer and poor people becoming poorer? Are we kind of exacerbating the problem by being involved in these sort of PES? And this is the main critique that's happened of PES in other places, and it makes sense, right? If you have a few large landowners who are able to put significant acreage into conservation, they're going to be accruing those material benefits, and smallholders that might be scattered around them are not going to be able to participate, and so you're potentially exacerbating these sort of social inequities. And then we also want to think through what are the mechanisms through which inequality and intended and unintended outcomes might be happening throughout this. And this picture is looking into the Parque Nacional Emboro, and so you're seeing this kind of mosaic of both protected land and working lands in this picture. So how are we doing this? So we're attempting a randomized control trial, and you can definitely bet that the economists on the team like this a lot more than the anthropologists. The basic idea here is that we have 130 communities who are about to have these contracts rolled out. And so we split that in half, and half the communities are going to be conditional, and half of them are going to be unconditional. And how those are distributed is random. And the other part is household surveys. So 2 years ago, I spent the summer in Bolivia pilot testing a survey that's being rolled out in all these communities. And these surveys measure wealth indicators, reasons for participation, community dynamics, so they're happening at the household level and also on a community level. And this gives us a pretty big statistical data set to be working with this sort of survey response data. We're also doing semi-structured interviews. So this was my job this last summer in the field, which is doing interviews with participants and non-participants in a systematic way to understand why they're participating in this program, and also to provide good qualitative social context for the quantitative survey data that we're rolling out in addition to the environmental data. And so when we're talking about, there's interdisciplinary research, right, where you have different disciplines in the room on a team working together, and then a transdisciplinary research is where those approaches are really informing each other. And this is an important part of thinking about how social science and environmental science can relate to each other, how we're learning from each other. And that's ultimately why it's really exciting to be presenting at a conference like this and talking and learning from all y'all, because you have these really different perspectives in the room, and the question of how you learn from each other, it's interesting to be a young scientist learning about this. So this picture is from what's called an entrega, and this is where the community members sign their contracts and are given the materials. So this is an example of the sort of polytube that you're seeing, and this is used for irrigation as well as drinking water infrastructure, and the yellow fencing is barbed wire as well. These guys are some of the local technicos. They are farm and ranch guys who grew up in these communities and are now working for this environmental NGO and are really the interface in the community, which is something important that we'll be talking about in a little bit. Finally, participant observation has been an important part of this study because we want to understand, why do people use incentives in certain ways? How do they play out in real life? And this is an example of their pretty cool hand roping technique that they do down there. We were giving a rabies vaccine, and so one guy will hand rope, and it's usually the old guy who's really good at roping, and then the young guys will go in and then hold the cow, and then they'll do the vaccination. And so I participated in a lot of this work to understand how these ranchers are using these incentives, why they think it's good or not good, and their opinion on the program. So what we've done so far are 77 semi-structured interviews in 9 communities across 4 municipalities. 550 surveys have been completed in 63 communities, and I caught 1 cow that day. So some of our preliminary findings here is that program design around conditionality, material incentives, and land use are all influencing participation rates. So in Bolivia, a national process known as saneamiento is underway, which is a titling process to give smallholders official written title. And this is a real prerequisite for participating in the program, because you have to show title to participate, but there's some other mechanisms that they use to validate people's tenure on land, and those sort of flexibilities in the program are really important to encourage participation. The material incentives themselves are a variant of where the ARA is a little different than the PES program, because people aren't just being paid cash, they're being incentivized with fences and pasture seed and irrigation tubing, and those projects have to be relevant to local people. And so the local field staff are really the translators who are making those materials relevant to local people, designing the irrigation projects, being basic extension agents to an area that doesn't have an extension service. And so the ability for people to participate is really predicated on those sort of relationships that are built at the bottom of the organizational scale. And I really noticed that when I was interviewing people and kind of in observing this program happen, these local people who are kind of the bottom, the roots, the rhizomes in the community is a really important aspect. And the municipal technical political alliances are important because this is where the sort of collaborations being talked about in this conference are being brought into existence. And so the NGO can't really do this work alone without the local governments. And so how you build those relationships and overcome some honestly pretty big political differences in a country like Bolivia, I think is a real testament to the savvy of this NGO and also a real importance in paying attention to local and regional politics when you're thinking about environmental conservation. And finally, in Bolivia, at the local level, the imperative to adapt agriculture to climate change is on the lips of just about everyone. So that picture that I showed you earlier of the Atajado project, the growing season has been changing and is being talked about. And these irrigation projects are a way to get 2 cycles of harvest in, which really helps with income for local producers. And being able to partner with these sort of NGOs to get this irrigation tubing out there is allowing them to have some additional extra income while helping with watershed issues. So really you do see these kind of win-win-win sort of situations. And then finally, it's really hard to not overemphasize how important the provision of basic infrastructure and services are in this area. This picture on the left was a community's drinking water. It is a mierda-filled pond that caused a lot of sickness in kids over the years. And this project organized with a private landowner upstream to put in a water intake up in this valley and run a tube about 80 kilometers that now provides these kids with clean drinking water. And so these material incentives have very real impacts on people's lives, and the protection of watersheds in working landscapes like this also has a big impact. And so these sort of projects are going to be kind of looked at as different sort of models, and we really want to be there with good social science to be able to have data to say, well, what are the impacts on the environment and what are the impacts on people's lives? And so in our preliminary findings, it's really important that we're going on beyond just simple market values. These people aren't participating just because they get material incentives. They have real relationships both to their land, but also to each other, and understanding the nature and complexity of those relationships and having good social science in relationship and in dialogue with hydrologists and ecologists really helps these sort of programs actually work, because we need a nuanced approach for understanding the nature of these sort of relationships. And I'll end there and take some questions.
Cool program, Will. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about what's driving the deforestation?
That's a really good question. So most people right now are paying attention to fires in the Amazon, which are a big deal. And there are significant fires also happening in Bolivia, and it's driving this conversation about what is causing deforestation. Now, large-scale ranching is often a big factor in this. And in the area that we're working in the Valles Cruzeños, that's actually a little bit east of where the primary deforestation is happening. The critique from local people is that government resettlement programs that are moving people from the highlands out into the Chiquitania area in particular is driving a lot of deforestation because there's not good agricultural techniques, so land gets worn out pretty quick. People sell, and then big soy companies are coming in, buying that land up, and then monocropping. And so that is kind of the political ecology of what's causing a lot of that deforestation, and the fires have been a result of that. Actually, this past weekend, about 1.5 million to 2 million people hit the street in Santa Cruz protesting these policies, and so we're seeing a lot of politics around that right now, so it's really something to pay attention to. Paul.
Wondering in relation to some of the other talks, is land clearing, sedimentation, slow
Absolutely. So this picture here at the beginning really shows kind of the land use problems that are happening. So this slash and burn agriculture is kind of the most common. What's been used around here where people, it's called chaqueoing. So people will chaqueo this part of the forest, put in a corn crop, a bean crop, and let it go for a couple years, and then allow pasture grass to go in, move cattle in for a couple years, and then maybe let the forest regrow. And so in that time, especially if it's in a riparian area, you have significant sedimentation sort of problems there. Some of the hydrology papers that were published last year by people looking at this project actually found a statistically not significant relationship between this ARA program and sedimentation issues in that, or in their basically water intakes. And one of the findings of that is that having a paid staff and people that are actively managing the sedimentation issues was allowing some communities to be able to deal with that. And so the implication there is that you can have a incentive structure, but you also need a social infrastructure to be able to manage some of these more complex social and hydrological issues.
I think we should probably call it there.
Okay, thanks y'all.
Thanks so much, Will. Very interesting.